It happened in broad daylight. A peaceful park. Kids playing. Joggers minding their business. The kind of place where nothing ever goes wrong until it does. A teenage girl sitting quietly on a bench, texting her mom, unaware she's about to be blindsided by a man who's been watching her from the shadows. In a split second, her phone is ripped from her hands. But here's what the thief didn't count on. Someone was watching him. Not just anyone, an ex-cop with a record of never letting bad guys get away. And that's where everything flips. Right here, in this video, you're going to find out exactly what happened. How a seemingly random act of theft turned into a moment no one in that park would ever forget. And trust me, you'll want to see how it ends. Now, I know you've seen dozens of these stories online. Phone gets snatched, girl gets robbed, and it usually ends with a quick headline and a blurred-out camera angle. But this one is different. Because what happened after the phone was taken wasn't caught on a security cam, it was witnessed in real time by someone who refused to stand by. The way it all unfolded was fast, intense, and deeply human. And if you're someone who's tired of feeling like the world's spinning out of control, this story might just restore a little faith. Because sometimes it only takes one person in the right place at the right time to change everything. Before we go any further, I want you to do one thing. Pause whatever else you're doing. Forget the other tabs, the texts, the background noise. Just lean in. Because by the time we reach the end of this video, you'll know exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it says about the world we live in today. This isn't just about a stolen phone. It's about instinct, about courage, about the split-second decisions that define who we are when no one else is watching. And if you're wondering whether the guy got away with it or not, let me just say this. It didn't go the way he expected. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had something taken from you? Not just a phone or a wallet, but that feeling of safety? That illusion that everything around you is under control? It's unsettling. And when it happens, it sticks with you. That's what makes this story so powerful. Because for the girl sitting on that park bench, it wasn't just a phone that was stolen. It was her sense of peace. Her right to feel safe in a public place. But what she didn't know, what the thief definitely didn't know, is that a man just a few yards away was watching him the whole time. A man who'd spent decades chasing down criminals, solving cases, reading people like open books. A man who didn't hang up his badge because he lost his edge, but because he knew how sharp it still was. Now, I don't want to spoil the best parts too soon, because where this goes next, you won't see it coming. But let me tell you, when the ex-cop gets involved, everything changes. There's a reason the phrase, once a cop, always a cop exists. And this guy? He doesn't just step in, he takes control. But not in the way you might expect. This isn't some action movie fight scene. This is real life. Real consequences. Real choices. And what the jogger does next, what he says, how he moves, how he reads the situation, well, let's just say it left more than a few people speechless. See, this is where the story digs deeper. Because this isn't just about justice, it's about timing. About being present, about knowing when to act and when to hold back. It's about a man who thought his days of chasing down criminals were over, and a teenage girl who just wanted to finish her day in peace. Two lives that should have never intersected, but did. And at the center of it all, a thief who thought he picked the perfect target, only to find himself caught in something much bigger than he ever imagined. I want you to think about this from another angle for a second. We live in a world where people walk past trouble every day. Where most of us, let's be honest, keep our heads down, our AirPods in, and pray it's not us. But every once in a while, someone steps up. And it's those people, the ones who take action without waiting for permission, who remind us of something important. That bravery doesn't need a badge. And decency doesn't need to go viral to matter. But in this case, it did. And the moment it did, it turned into something unforgettable. So if you clicked this video because you were curious, or you wanted a little justice, or maybe just some hope in a crazy world, you're in the right place. Because what happens next is something you won't want to miss. And I promise, by the time we reach the end, you'll understand exactly why this story matters. Not just for that girl, not just for the ex-cop, but for all of us watching from the sidelines. This is the kind of moment that makes you look at a stranger and wonder what they'd do if the world went sideways. and more importantly, what you would do. Now, I know some of you are thinking, okay, but what really happened? Did the thief get caught? Did the ex-cop chase him down? Was there a confrontation? A twist? All I can say is keep watching, because you're about to find out exactly how it unfolded, step by step. And the final 5 minutes? Let's just say, you'll remember them long after the video ends. So stick with me. You're not just watching a story, you're part of it now. And the best part? It's just getting started. The man who changed everything that afternoon in the park wasn't wearing a badge anymore. No radio crackling on his hip. No cruiser idling nearby. Just a sweat-darkened t-shirt, jogging shoes caked in dust, and a baseball cap pulled low to keep the sun out of his eyes. From a distance, he looked like every other guy out for a run, older, steady, alone. But behind that quiet exterior was a mind that hadn't stopped scanning for trouble, even years after turning in his shield. His name was Mark Dalton, and before he retired, he was the guy other cops called when things went sideways. 23 years in the LAPD, 12 of them in violent crimes, and a reputation for spotting danger before it even made its first move. That kind of instinct doesn't fade. It just waits. And on that day, in that very park, it found its moment. Mark had only just started jogging again, 3 weeks back, after a long winter that had been harder on him than most. Not just physically, but mentally. After losing his partner to cancer last fall, the grief had stuck to him like static, impossible to shake. He'd spent months cooped up in his apartment, barely eating, skipping calls from old friends. The job had always been demanding, but losing someone who'd been more like a brother than a colleague had knocked the wind from his lungs. It was his daughter, Ava, who finally got through to him. A simple text that read, "You're still here, so live like it." It was enough to push him back out into the world, slowly. First a walk around the block, then a jog through the neighborhood. Now this, his third run through Madison Park, earbuds in, music low, eyes always moving.
He almost didn't go that day.
His knee had been acting up, and he considered staying home, watching a Dodgers game on mute with the dog. But something pulled him out the door, something quiet and unresolved. And that's where things begin to tangle, because sometimes the choices we make without thinking become the ones that define everything. Mark had passed the girl on the bench twice before it happened. Young, maybe 16 or 17, had bent over her phone, bag tucked close. Nothing about her seemed out of place, but Mark's gut had tightened anyway. There'd been a guy standing near the water fountain on the far side of the path, pretending to stretch. A hoodie on despite the heat, glancing up too often, eyes twitching from side to side like a street dog looking for scraps. Mark clocked him immediately, too nervous, too tense, too hungry for something. What Mark didn't know, what nobody did, was that the girl, whose name was Lily, had only just returned to the city. Her mother had pulled her out of school a few months back after a family emergency, and now she was trying to settle back in. That afternoon was her first time alone since they moved into their new apartment across town. She was texting a friend she hadn't seen in almost a year, trying to figure out where they should meet, where they used to go. It was supposed to be a normal day, a step toward freedom, but that illusion shattered the moment she looked up and saw a stranger rushing straight at her. The man didn't speak, didn't threaten, just snatched the phone with a force that made her stumble sideways, nearly hitting her head on the edge of the bench. By the time she screamed, he was already sprinting, disappearing between trees and joggers and strollers like smoke in the wind. People looked up, confused, unsure whether to help, call someone, or just keep walking. But Mark didn't hesitate. His body moved before his mind caught up. All those years of pursuit, of reading angles, calculating distance, listening to breath and footfall, they kicked back in like muscle memory. He took off running, his legs aching but his focus razor-sharp, already predicting where the thief would veer next. But here's where it gets interesting. Because this wasn't just some random lowlife looking for a quick score. There were layers to him, details that didn't fit the usual profile. For starters, the guy didn't run like someone untrained. His form was clean. He dodged obstacles with the ease of someone who'd done this before, maybe not as a thief, but as someone used to moving fast under pressure. And when Mark turned the corner near the baseball field, the man didn't just keep running. He disappeared. Vanished. as if he'd known the layout of the park better than anyone had a right to. That's when the questions started piling up. How did he vanish so quickly? Why had he targeted that girl? Was it truly random, or was there something more going on? And why did Mark feel like he'd seen that running style before, somewhere in a case file or grainy surveillance footage long buried in the precinct archives? He didn't have the answers yet, but the pieces weren't lining up. Something was off. Later that day, after the police arrived and statements were taken, Mark lingered near the playground, speaking quietly with Lily and her mom. The girl was shaken, but strong. She said she didn't recognize the man, but something about his eyes felt familiar, like she'd seen him somewhere. Maybe weeks ago, maybe longer. She couldn't place it. Her mom mentioned that someone had been hanging around their apartment complex recently. A guy in a beat-up sedan, always parked just far enough away to not draw attention. At the time, she thought it was just coincidence.
But now?
Mark didn't say much. He didn't want to spook them. But in his gut, he felt it again. That tight, familiar coil of tension that meant something bigger was at play. He went home that night and pulled out an old box from the closet. Case files he wasn't supposed to have, reports he'd kept for reasons even he didn't fully understand. And as he flipped through them, one page caught his eye, a photo of a suspect from an unsolved string of robberies back in 17. Same build, same gait, same eyes. But that suspect had disappeared. No trace. No ID. Just a nickname passed between dealers and fences in the underground. Ghost. And now, after all these years, it was starting to feel like maybe the ghost wasn't gone, maybe he'd just been waiting. As the pieces begin to stir in Mark's mind, you start to realize this isn't just about a man jogging through a park and playing hero. This is about something unfinished. Something that's coming back around. And the more you think about it, the more it feels like Lily wasn't chosen at random. Which raises the question, who else is involved? Because red flags are starting to wave. A neighbor of Lily's who gave a strange statement to police, a guy who claimed to be walking his dog that day but had no leash, no pet, and no clear reason to be in the area. A park maintenance worker who was supposed to be on the west side that afternoon but was spotted near the fountain, right where the hoodie guy was pretending to stretch. Too many moving parts. Too many coincidences. And Mark knew better than to believe in coincidence. So now the hunt begins, not just for a stolen phone, but for answers that reach further back than anyone expects. And if Mark is right, if the signs he's seeing are real, then what happened in that park was just the beginning. Because when shadows start to reappear in the daylight, someone's pulling strings behind the scenes. And that someone? They're still out there. The next morning, Mark woke up with the case still turning in his head like a puzzle, missing too many pieces. The early light slipped through the blinds, but it wasn't warm. It felt like something cold had crept in overnight. He sat at the kitchen table, coffee steaming beside a stack of old files, trying to make sense of what his instincts were screaming at him. Everything about the park theft felt too rehearsed, too smooth, like it had been planned down to the second. And that kind of precision didn't come from some street-level petty thief. Someone had studied the layout. Someone had watched Lily. And someone had known exactly when to strike. He had planned to drive back to the park, maybe walk the route again, and see if anything stuck out. But just as he grabbed his keys, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. Stop digging. You don't want to know where this road leads. No name, no signature, nothing. Just a clear warning. The kind that makes your blood slow down a little. Most people would have shrugged it off or maybe even reported it. But Mark wasn't most people. He stared at the message for a long minute, then locked his phone and walked out the door. If someone didn't want him poking around, that meant he was getting close to something worth hiding. When he arrived at the police station, he found out the first real roadblock had already hit. The incident report he'd helped file, the one with Lily's statement and the eyewitness descriptions, was missing.
Not lost.
Not misfiled.
Gone.
The sergeant on duty swore it was logged in the system last night, but now it showed up as pending with no uploaded document. Mark pressed harder, asking who had last accessed the file, but the response was oddly mechanical, restricted by administrator. That was unusual. Public parks, nonviolent crimes, Minor thefts like that don't usually get flagged for restricted access. It didn't sit right, especially not when he was told the CCTV footage from the park's security cameras malfunctioned right around the time of the theft. That kind of coincidence makes any cop's stomach turn. Frustrated but undeterred, Mark paid a visit to Lily's apartment complex. Her mom answered the door, visibly on edge. She let him in, but her voice was tight, her eyes constantly flicking toward the windows like someone expecting something or someone. She said a man had come by the building late the previous night, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious at the park. He claimed to be a private investigator. No badge. No business card. Just a voice that seemed calm, too calm, like someone who'd practiced what to say. She didn't trust him. Neither did Mark. The way she described him, slim, close-cropped beard, jacket too clean for the weather, sounded familiar. And then she mentioned something else. A photo had gone missing from their living room shelf. Not valuable, not framed, just a little candid picture of Lily at her old school, the only copy they had. She thought it had just fallen. But now she wasn't sure. Neither was Mark. That same afternoon, Mark finally tracked down a guy he remembered from the old robbery task force, Eddie Ramos, now working private security for one of the tech firms downtown. They hadn't talked in years, but when Mark described the suspect, Eddie's face tightened. He wouldn't say much at first. Just nodded, frowned, and muttered something about the Holloway job. That hit a nerve. Holloway was a cold case from nearly a decade ago, an armored truck heist outside Sacramento. No suspects. No evidence. Just a vanishing act that cost the company millions. But Eddie had always believed there was a mole involved, someone feeding the crew inside intel. When Mark pressed further, Eddie finally cracked and admitted he'd heard whispers recently. Same ghost nickname. Same MO. But now the guy wasn't alone. He had people. A crew. And worse, someone was helping cover their tracks from inside. That changed everything. This wasn't just about Lily. This wasn't even about the phone anymore. It was about someone reaching back through a history most people had stopped trying to connect. And then came the twist that rattled Mark more than he expected. A name from his own past appeared in a police document he wasn't supposed to see. A partial signature at the bottom of an amended report, one line above where Lily's original statement used to be. A signature he recognized because he'd trained that officer himself nearly 15 years ago, Kendrick Shaw. Back then, Shaw was ambitious, always trying to prove himself, eager to rise through the ranks. But there'd been whispers, complaints, quiet investigations that never went anywhere. Mark had let it go, even vouched for him once. Now he wondered if that had been a mistake. It wasn't just the report. A few hours later, Mark discovered something else, something far more unsettling. His apartment had been searched. Nothing broken, nothing stolen, but the box of case files? Opened. Some were out of order. Others were missing pages. Whoever did it knew what to look for. They weren't there for valuables. They were there to see what Mark knew, what he remembered, and how close he was to stitching the truth together. That night, as he sat in the dark with the bourbon glass half full and the dog pacing at his feet, Mark knew he'd stepped into something far deeper than a park mugging. He had questions stacked on questions, but too many of the answers led to people he once trusted.
Shaw.
The investigator who visited Lily's building. The vanished CCTV footage. And now, someone deliberately wiping parts of the past clean. The closer he got, the more it felt like a ghost wasn't haunting this case. It was controlling it. Then came the final blow. He received a call from an old contact at City Records who owed him a favor. The man had quietly pulled property ownership info near Lily's apartment. And one of the units directly across from hers, the one with a line of sight to her window, was recently leased to a shell company. A fake name. A fake address. But the emergency contact listed at the bottom was real. It was Kendrick Shaw. Mark didn't sleep that night. And now you've got to ask yourself, if the man who once wore the badge is now the one hiding in shadows, how many others are still pretending to stand in the light? Just as Mark was beginning to process the tangled mess that Shaw's name had reintroduced into his world, a secondary shockwave rippled into the story. one that would throw everything he thought he understood into question. It came not through the front door or his phone, but from someone he hadn't heard from in nearly 4 years. Amanda Hayes, his former partner on the force and the only person who knew the darkest corners of the cases they'd worked together, called him in the middle of the night. Her voice was tense, not scared, but the kind of controlled alarm only a seasoned officer could manage under pressure. She didn't waste time. "Someone broke into my place," she said flatly. "Didn't take anything, but they left something. And I think it was meant for you." Mark didn't ask why she didn't call the cops. He already knew. Once you've been part of the system long enough, you learn the difference between random break-ins and targeted warnings. He drove across the city in silence, feeling the weight of it all settling deeper into his chest. Amanda lived in a quiet suburb, low fences, trimmed lawns, the kind of place where nothing ever happened until it did. When he arrived, she led him into the kitchen and pointed to a single manila envelope on the table. It had no address, no postmark, just the word Holloway scrawled in thick black ink across the front. Inside the envelope were 5 grainy photos. They looked like stills pulled from old surveillance footage, printed in haste, maybe even from a private archive. Each image captured a man, possibly the same one, walking near key locations tied to the Holloway case. The bank parking lot, the armored truck stop, even the motel room where one of the drivers was last seen. But the real shock wasn't the man in the images. It was the timestamp on one of the shots. It was dated 2 weeks after the official report claimed the suspect had fled the country. Either the timeline was fabricated, or someone had faked an international escape to bury the investigation.
But why?
And who had this footage for so long without releasing it? Amanda wasn't sure how the envelope got there, but she said it was placed inside her locked garage sometime after midnight. The door had no signs of forced entry. Her cameras? Disabled. Just like in Mark's apartment. Whoever did it wasn't some tech-savvy thief. They were methodical, precise, and wanted her to find the envelope, wanted Mark to find it. She also confessed something that made his blood run cold. A few days before, she'd received a phone call from someone claiming to be from the Department of Internal Affairs, asking about Mark, his activities, his contacts. But when she asked for credentials, the call dropped. The number was untraceable. She hadn't told Mark earlier because she assumed it was just a bureaucratic error or maybe a scare tactic. Now, she wasn't so sure. That night, Mark sat in his car outside Amanda's house for hours, turning everything over in his mind. It was starting to feel less like he was chasing a criminal and more like he was being baited, drawn into a web where every step deeper exposed him to someone watching from the outside. The possibility that someone within law enforcement, someone who had stayed in the system while Mark walked away, might be orchestrating this from inside began to feel more likely. Shaw wasn't the only potential traitor. And now that Amanda was involved, the stakes had jumped from personal to strategic. Whoever was behind this wasn't just tying up loose ends. They were trying to manipulate the past and control the narrative of events everyone thought were long buried. But then, just when Mark thought things couldn't become more disorienting, another piece of evidence emerged, something that clashed with everything Lily had initially said about the day her phone was taken. A random eyewitness, a jogger who had only recently come forward after recognizing Lily's face on a local news segment, claimed he saw her hand the phone over willingly to the man before he took off. He even remembered thinking it looked like some kind of exchange, quick, quiet, not aggressive. It didn't make sense. Lily was frightened. She had scratches on her arm, and she insisted the phone was yanked from her grip. But what if the witness was right? Or worse, what if Lily was hiding something? Mark didn't want to believe it. She was just a kid. Innocent. Or so he thought. But now even her role in the story began to feel uncertain. Was she being manipulated? Threatened? Or was she somehow involved in something far bigger than she could even understand? The truth had become a kaleidoscope, changing shape with every new angle, every new witness, every missing piece that surfaced with blood-stained clarity. The ripple effects kept building. Mark got another anonymous message, this time a photo of his old badge, cracked in half, placed in front of the precinct he once worked at. No words, just the image. The message was loud enough without them. You were once one of us, now you're not.
Stay gone.
The walls were closing in. The case wasn't just cold anymore. It was radioactive. And yet, Mark couldn't stop. Because the deeper he dug, the more it became clear this wasn't just about Lily, or Holloway, or even Shaw. This was about something buried beneath the surface of the department he'd once sworn loyalty to. Something rotten. Something deliberate. But what Mark didn't know, not yet, was that another name from his past was about to re-emerge, someone he'd long believed was dead. And when that name finally appears, it will change everything. Mark barely slept that night. Every noise outside his window felt loaded with implication. Every flicker of light down the hallway seemed to threaten movement just beyond his vision. The envelope from Amanda, the jogger's testimony, the silent messages, each one chipped away at his grip on reality. He was no longer just looking into a case. The case had started looking into him. By morning, the stillness in the air felt different. Not peaceful, too quiet, like a breath held too long. He knew something was coming, but not when or from where. So he checked every lock, backed up his files, and drove to the only place he still trusted, Amanda's. But Amanda wasn't home. Her garage door was half open. That was the first red flag. She never left it like that, not even when running errands. Her front door was locked, but her curtains, usually drawn tight, hung open at strange angles like someone had peered out in a hurry. Mark called her phone twice. Voicemail. The third time, it rang once and then cut off. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. Keys still on the hook. Coffee mug half full on the kitchen table. No signs of struggle. Just absence. A kind of eerie vacancy that didn't make sense. Mark walked through the house calling her name softly, the way you do when you know you won't get an answer, but can't help hoping anyway. Then, in the living room, he noticed the envelope was gone. The one she had shown him the night before. The table where it sat was bare, no indentations, no markings, like it had never been there at all. That's when the fear started to grip him, not the fight or flight kind, but the heavy, suffocating kind that sits in your lungs and grows roots. Mark wasn't just in danger. He was being watched, controlled. Whoever was orchestrating this wasn't just a few steps ahead. They were in the room, metaphorically speaking, shaping his every move, knowing where he'd go and when. As he stood in Amanda's silent living room, trying to make sense of her vanishing, he realized something even more terrifying. If they could get to her, they could get to him. And worse, to Lily. He drove straight to Lily's house. She answered the door with tired eyes and shaky hands, like she hadn't slept either. There was a car parked across the street all night, she whispered before he could even say hello. It didn't move. Engine off. Just sat there. I don't know who it was. Mark walked past her and looked out the window. Nothing was there now. But she wasn't making it up. She'd seen something. And then she said something that cracked his last bit of composure. Someone knocked on my door around 3 a.m. I didn't answer. I was too scared. But whoever it was, they left this. She handed him a folded piece of paper. No envelope. No signature. Just 7 words scribbled hastily in all caps. Stop digging or she'll disappear too. That was when everything changed. This wasn't about closure anymore. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about Holloway, or the phone, or some decades-old case anymore. This was a message. A warning. But who was she? Amanda? Lily? Or someone else? The room started spinning with implications. Whoever left that note knew he'd find it. Knew he'd be there within hours of Amanda going dark. Knew every part of his pattern. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was fact. Someone was following him. And not just following, predicting. Manipulating. Mark's heart pounded in his ears as he helped Lily pack a bag and quietly moved her to a safe house he still had access to, an old friend's cabin deep in the Catskills, off-grid, secure, and known to no one still in uniform. He stayed long enough to make sure she was okay, gave her a prepaid phone with only one number in it, his, and made her swear not to open the door for anyone else. Not even him, unless he gave a specific code word. The gravity of it all settled into his bones on that drive back. This was bigger than corruption. Bigger than cover-ups. Someone had the power to erase people, to make them vanish without a trace, and to deliver threats with surgical precision. When he got home, there was a message waiting on his own front porch. A single Polaroid taped to the door. The image was of Amanda, tied to a chair, conscious, but clearly beaten. Her mouth was gagged, her eyes wide, but not pleading. Angry. Furious. The photo wasn't just a threat. It was bait. And the timestamp printed along the bottom read just 2 hours earlier. Mark clutched the photo, rage bubbling just under his skin, but with it came another realization. They wanted him to react. They were drawing him in, testing him, seeing how far he'd go. The story was no longer about what happened to Lily's phone in the park. That was just the spark. The explosion was happening now in real time, and he was at the epicenter of it. Every lead now looked like a trap. Every piece of the puzzle came with consequences. And the worst part? He didn't know who he could trust. Not Amanda's former contacts. Not his old department. Not even the few friends he thought were still allies. Everything was unraveling, and fast. But as the clock ticked and the walls closed in, Mark knew one thing for certain. If they were bold enough to leave him a photo of Amanda still alive, it meant she wasn't gone yet. But time was running out. And whoever was playing this game was about to make their boldest move yet. The next morning, as Mark sat hunched over the photo of Amanda, its glossy surface now creased from being clutched too many times, he caught something. Something tiny, almost invisible, and definitely unintentional. Behind Amanda, in the far left corner of the Polaroid, there was a reflection. A barely visible glint in what looked like a wall mirror. At first, it meant nothing. But the more he stared, the more the shape became familiar. A curved edge. A symbol. A shape etched into a jacket. Then it hit him, it was a badge. Not just any badge, but one with the exact same department emblem he'd worn for over 20 years. The person behind Amanda, the person holding her hostage, wasn't just some outsider or a criminal mastermind. It was someone from inside the force. And not just inside. It had to be someone still active, with access to police resources, intelligence, and surveillance. It wasn't a criminal investigation gone cold. It was an operation. A cover-up. And now, it had become a manhunt, with him as the prey. Mark knew exactly what he needed. Someone who could access the internal logs without raising alarms. Someone with just enough clearance to slip under the radar, but who had reason to still owe him a favor. That led him to Ray Calderon. Ray had been Mark's partner for a decade, until he retired early after a botched raid and a lawsuit that nearly wrecked both of their careers. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since Ray disappeared into private security and semi-retirement in Florida. But when Mark called that old number, Ray picked up after the second ring. There was silence, then a long exhale, and then Ray's voice, grave and shaking. "I was wondering how long it'd take you to call. Mark, you're not going to like what I'm about to tell you." In a hushed, broken voice, Ray laid it out, how years ago, a task force had been formed inside the department. Not an official one. An unofficial, backdoor unit made up of a few detectives, 2 captains, and 1 highly connected tech analyst. Their job? To scrub evidence. Not for the sake of justice, but to clean up after people who didn't want justice at all. Politicians. Developers. Judges. People with enough money and leverage to bury truths before they ever saw daylight. It started small, deleting dashcam footage here, losing forensic evidence there. But then it got darker. People who knew too much started going missing. Whistleblowers wound up in car accidents. And worst of all, victims who asked too many questions suddenly found themselves under arrest, blackmailed, or publicly ruined. Ray had known about it. And worse, he'd helped. Not directly. Not always willingly. But enough to know that Mark digging into Lily's phone theft had stirred up ghosts that were never meant to surface again. That phone wasn't just stolen, it was intercepted. Because it captured something it shouldn't have. Not an ordinary robbery, but a transaction. A meeting. An exchange between someone powerful and someone protected. And now the task force had been reactivated. Not to solve a case, but to shut it down.
Permanently.
Mark's blood ran cold. Amanda had found something. Maybe she hadn't even known what she was looking at when she opened the folder. Maybe she was just connecting dots no one else had dared to connect. But someone saw her do it. Someone inside. And now she was being held somewhere off-grid by a group of people who had law enforcement training, tech access, and no accountability. And Mark? He was being used. Played like a pawn on a chessboard that had already been set before the first move was made. But that wasn't even the worst part. As Ray's voice got quieter, more hesitant, he finally said something that made Mark sit down, knees weak, stomach hollow. "She came to me first, Mark. Amanda. Before she ever called you. She wanted to know if you were clean." Mark blinked, stunned. "She said she couldn't tell who to trust, not even you. She asked me point blank if you were ever part of the task force back in the early years, if maybe, just maybe, you'd erase things too." The words hit like a gut punch. Amanda had doubted him. And maybe for good reason. Because Mark had once helped make something disappear. Years ago. A favor for a superior. A small case, he thought. Nothing serious. But what if it wasn't? What if his past actions he buried and never thought of again, had triggered this whole nightmare? What if Amanda had been taken not just because of what she found, but because she trusted the wrong person? Mark stared at the cracked Polaroid again, eyes darting to the faint badge shape in the mirror, heart pounding against his ribs. Everything he thought he knew was wrong. And someone, maybe more than one person, was pulling strings on both sides. The question wasn't just who kidnapped Amanda anymore. It was who set the whole thing in motion. And more importantly, why was Mark's name ever connected to it in the first place? Mark had always believed in a few unshakable rules. Trust your gut. Protect the innocent. And above all, never betray your own. But sitting in his dimly lit kitchen at 3 a.m., staring down at the burner phone Ray had sent him, every rule he lived by suddenly felt like it had been written in sand. On the other end of the line was not a stranger, not some faceless enemy in the shadows. It was Lisa, his late wife's sister, Amanda's aunt, the one person who had always stood by him through the funeral, through the years of trying to be both father and mother to Amanda, through the long nights when grief turned into guilt. Now, her voice on the line wasn't comforting. It was cold, calculated, and what she said twisted something deep in his chest. "You need to stop, Mark," she said flatly. "Walk away, before this swallows you whole. I'm telling you this because I care. But if you keep pushing, you'll make enemies you can't come back from." Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. For weeks, he'd been pulling strings, chasing shadows, risking everything to bring Amanda home, and now the one person he thought would support him no matter what was basically warning him to quit. Not advising. Warning. He asked her directly. How did she know what he was doing, what he'd uncovered? And the silence on the other end said more than her words ever could. She was involved. Not just as a bystander, but deeply, knowingly involved in something that had placed Amanda in danger. When he pushed harder, demanding answers, Lisa broke down, but it wasn't the kind of crying that came from remorse. It was panic. Frustration. "You don't get it, Mark." Amanda wasn't just snooping. She was going to expose everything. There are people, powerful people, who've spent years covering this up. Amanda didn't just stumble into this. She kicked a hornet's nest wide open. And if you don't stop, they'll come for you next. Mark hung up before she could say more. He didn't want to hear excuses. He didn't want another lecture about risks or reputations. What he needed now was clarity, but what he had instead was a tangle of loyalties and lies that made every next step feel like walking blindfolded across a minefield. Because now he had to make a choice. Keep chasing the truth, knowing full well that Lisa, someone he'd trusted like family, had been helping to bury it or back down, disappear, and hope Amanda would somehow make it out on her own. But Mark knew that wasn't an option. Not anymore. Things escalated fast after that. His apartment was broken into 2 nights later. Nothing stolen. No mess. Just one thing moved, Amanda's old high school photo, which had been taken from a shelf and placed on the center of his bed. A message. Not loud. Not violent. But surgical. Psychological. And that's when the ultimatum came. A man, mid-40s, well-dressed, voice like polished marble, cornered Mark in a grocery store parking lot. No weapons. No threats. Just a simple envelope and a smile. Inside was a photo of Amanda, alive, but clearly being held somewhere, gray walls, steel door, and a timestamp from just 24 hours ago. The man leaned in close and said quietly, "You want her back? There's a file in a storage unit off Route 9. All we need is for it to disappear. One file. That's it. You do that and she walks free. You refuse and she disappears forever." That file, Mark already knew which one it was. It was the last remaining evidence linking a retired congressman to the underground task force. The file Amanda had originally copied. The file she never should have seen. And now, destroying it meant wiping away the only concrete lead he had, but it also meant saving her life. For the first time in his life, Mark didn't know what to do. If he burned the file, Amanda might come home, but the men behind this would never be held accountable. If he refused, the file might expose them, but Amanda would pay the price. And hovering just below his thoughts was a darker question. Was it already too late? Was this photo just a carrot on a stick, a cruel game to push him into destroying the truth with nothing to show for it? He sat in his car long after the man had walked away, the envelope in his lap, the weight of it far heavier than paper. This wasn't just about Amanda anymore. It was about justice, legacy, and guilt. Every decision Mark had made in his past, every shortcut, every cover-up, every time he looked the other way, all of it had led here. And now, with his goddaughter's life on the line, the price of redemption might be too high to pay. But there was one thing he hadn't considered yet, one person he hadn't spoken to in all this. A silent presence whose name hadn't come up once, but whose fingerprints were now beginning to show up in unexpected places. A detective from the task force's earliest days who vanished before the first internal review. Someone Mark had once believed to be dead. Now, according to Ray, there were whispers she was still alive and working from the inside. The moment Mark stepped inside the dimly lit storage unit off Route 9, he knew he was being watched. The air was thick with mildew, dust dancing in the beam of his flashlight as he swept it across rusted filing cabinets and cracked linoleum tiles. The unit had the stale, untouched silence of a place that hadn't seen daylight in years, and yet the uneasy prickle at the back of his neck told him he wasn't alone. In his hands he held the key, both literally and figuratively, to the truth. A battered manila folder sat inside a locked drawer exactly where they said it would be. But what he didn't expect was the second file, just inches away, unmarked, and left behind like a forgotten secret begging to be noticed. And once he cracked it open, Mark's world collapsed in on itself. Inside were surveillance photos, timestamps, financial transactions, evidence that the task force Amanda had stumbled across wasn't some rogue operation gone astray. It was part of something far more orchestrated, far-reaching, and disturbingly systematic. Politicians, corporate leaders, law enforcement, names he recognized, names he had worked with, names that were supposed to be untouchable. They weren't just turning a blind eye. They were funding it, shaping it, feeding off of it. What started as an investigation into a few missing persons had grown into a grotesque lattice of corruption and control that had swallowed entire communities whole. For years. And Amanda, in her fierce determination to do what was right, had cracked the outer shell of something built to stay buried. That realization hit Mark like a freight train, but it wasn't until he saw the last photo in the file that his breath caught in his throat. It was Ray, smiling, standing beside a man Mark hadn't seen in a decade, Chief Dale Morgan, the very person who had buried the internal affairs case that forced Mark into early retirement. Ray, the one who claimed to be helping him off the grid, guiding him from the shadows, was a plant, a handler, and now it made sense why he always seemed one step ahead. Why every clue felt like it was placed rather than found. Mark had been a puppet, his grief, his rage, all manipulated to steer him exactly where they needed him to go. The door to the storage unit slammed shut behind him, and Mark spun around, drawing his weapon instinctively. A voice echoed from the darkness, low and steady. "You were never supposed to get this far, Mark. But I have to admit, you still surprise me." It was Dale Morgan, older now, slower, but with the same hollow confidence in his eyes that had once terrified witnesses into silence. Behind him stood two men Mark didn't recognize, armed, calm, professional. They weren't there to talk. Dale raised his hand. "Don't do anything stupid. You already know how this ends." Mark's finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't pull it. He couldn't, not yet.
He needed more time.
He needed to survive just a few more minutes. Because as far as they knew, he had destroyed the original file. They didn't know about the duplicate he'd uploaded hours earlier to a private server, the same one Amanda had tried to send before she was taken. The same one now linked to a failsafe email timed to release the contents publicly if he didn't disable it in the next 24 hours. But Dale wasn't bluffing when he stepped forward. "You think the truth matters? You think anyone's going to believe a disgraced ex-cop and a teenage runaway over men who write the laws? We own the truth. We shape it. All you've done is buy your niece a longer leash." His words oozed certainty, but behind his bravado was something else, panic. He knew the server existed. He just didn't know who else had access to it. And that gave Mark the smallest edge. A sudden crash broke through the tension. The side wall of the storage unit exploded inward as an unmarked van rammed through, scattering everyone. Mark ducked instinctively, gun raised, only to see a blur of motion as someone leapt out of the driver's seat, smoke and headlights swirling around them. A woman. Not young. Not old. Eyes cold with purpose. The one Ray swore was dead. Detective Elena Graves. She grabbed Mark by the collar and yanked him toward the van. "You want to save your niece?
Move. Now."
The next few moments were a blur of gunfire, shouted commands, and screeching tires. But all Mark could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears and Elena's voice yelling over the chaos. "You were never the target, Mark. Amanda was the insurance policy. You were the weapon." He didn't have time to process what that meant, not then. But her words burrowed deep into his mind, burning with implication. This wasn't about a single girl. This wasn't about revenge or redemption. It was about control, turning people into pawns, twisting justice into a trap. And worst of all, he had played right into their hands. The final showdown didn't come with sirens or an army of flashing lights. It arrived in silence, on a rain-soaked rooftop overlooking the city Amanda once called home. A place forgotten by time, where rusted steel met broken glass and the skyline bled into the horizon like a wound that never healed. Mark stood there, heart pounding beneath his soaked jacket, watching the storm clouds churn above him, as if the sky itself knew something was about to break. And opposite him stood Ray, no longer the friendly voice guiding him through the shadows, but the orchestrator of chaos, the man who had lied with a straight face while watching Mark inch closer to the edge of madness. Behind him, chained to a rusted pipe, bruised and shivering, was Amanda.
Alive. Barely.
Her eyes met Mark's, wide with disbelief, and for a moment, time froze between them. "You really think you can change anything?" Ray's voice cracked through the wind, sharper than any bullet. "We gave you a purpose, Mark. We let you feel like a hero again. Without us, you'd still be rotting in that apartment, clutching a badge no one respected anymore. You were nothing." But Mark didn't flinch. The old version of him might have taken the bait, might have tried to justify his pain, his years in exile, his need for redemption. But now, in the glare of everything Ray had done, those justifications felt empty. The truth was simpler. They had used Amanda as bait. They had used him as a weapon. And somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being a pawn. He'd started fighting back. "I was nothing," Mark said quietly, stepping forward, "until I realized people like you need men like me to stay broken." Ray's smirk didn't waver, but his eyes flicked toward the edge of the rooftop, where Elena stood in the shadows, rifle slung over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. She'd followed Mark here on her own terms, claiming she had proof that Dale Morgan had never acted alone. She had files, recordings, statements from former agents, even financial ties that led to black budget accounts buried in off-the-books programs. But it wasn't enough to expose the truth in court. They needed something undeniable. And that's when Amanda's voice crackled through the comms earlier that night, saying she remembered something important. Amanda saw you, Mark said now, raising his voice over the rain. Not just you, Ray.
She saw what you did.
The people you met. You thought she was just a kid who'd panic and disappear, but she remembered every damn thing. Ray's composure cracked, just slightly. She's traumatized. She doesn't even know what she saw. Mark took another step. You had the hard drives destroyed. You faked records. You even tried to burn the safe house. But you missed one thing. Ray's smile vanished entirely. What? She wrote it down. At that moment, Elena tossed something through the rain. A plastic bag with a single, torn page inside, the ink running but still legible. Amanda's handwriting. A full name.
A date.
A location. And a passcode. Ray lunged. The next seconds unfolded like slow motion. Amanda screamed. Mark raised his weapon and Elena fired. The shot hit Ray in the shoulder, spinning him backward toward the ledge. He teetered, gripping the rusted railing, but he didn't fall. Not yet. Breathing hard, blood soaking through his shirt, Ray looked at Mark with something between hatred and sorrow. You don't understand, he gasped. This goes way beyond me. You think you've won? You haven't even seen the real list. What list? Mark growled, stepping closer, gun steady. Ray laughed, choking on his own blood. The girls? The runaways? Amanda wasn't the first. She wasn't even on the list. Mark's face went white. What are you talking about? Ray's voice dropped to a whisper. She was the backup. The original target escaped. Someone else saw everything. Someone smarter. Before Mark could respond, Ray reached into his coat, too fast for anyone to stop, and pulled something from his pocket. Not a weapon. A flash drive. He held it up, taunting. You want the truth? Here it is. But it only matters if you know how to read it. In that moment, Elena moved again, fast and cold, kicking the weapon from Ray's hand and sending the flash drive skittering across the rooftop. But Ray didn't chase it. Instead, he smiled one last time and let go. Mark lunged, but it was too late. Ray disappeared over the edge, his scream swallowed by the wind. The silence afterward was unbearable. Amanda cried, not from pain, but from the sheer pressure of it all finally cracking. Elena retrieved the flash drive and handed it to Mark without a word. Together, they freed Amanda and stood in the storm, watching the sky shift from black to gray. And just when Mark thought it was over, just when the adrenaline began to fade and the ache of everything they'd been through settled into his bones, Amanda looked up at him, eyes wide with new fear. She held something in her hand, a slip of paper from Ray's coat, a list. But it wasn't just names, it was dates, addresses. And one name Mark hadn't heard in years. His daughter's. The screen fades to black. In the weeks that followed, the city seemed quieter, not because it was safer, but because the silence had changed. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, when the wreckage is still fresh and people are too busy counting losses to speak aloud. Mark sat on the edge of the hospital bed, watching Amanda sleep. Her face was bruised but peaceful, a far cry from the frantic girl who had sprinted through that park only days ago, phone clutched like a lifeline, running from shadows she couldn't yet name. She'd been moved to a secure location under protective custody, her statement recorded in full, and the flash drive had been decrypted by Elena and passed along to a contact in the Justice Department. The fallout had been immediate. Names came pouring out, judges, businessmen, retired military officers. The list read like a who's who of American power, and though arrests were still pending and some names remained redacted from public record, a quiet reckoning had begun. But it wasn't victory that Mark felt. It was something far heavier. He hadn't returned to his old apartment since the night everything unraveled. He couldn't, not after what Ray had said, not after seeing his daughter's name on that list. She'd gone missing 5 years ago, labeled a runaway, her case buried under bureaucracy and silence. Mark had blamed himself for years, drowning in guilt until the bottle replaced his badge. But now, for the first time, he saw the possibility that she hadn't just left. Maybe she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to. Maybe she'd been trying to stop it before he even knew it existed. And now, That same list connected Amanda, Ray, the rogue agency, and Mark's own past in a way that made his stomach turn every time he closed his eyes. He didn't know if his daughter was alive or just another name marked for silence, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Elena stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching through the glass. She was the only one left he trusted, though even that trust was held together by fraying thread. She had secrets, more than she admitted. During their debriefing, she confessed that she'd once worked peripherally with the same agency that groomed Ray, though she claimed she never crossed the ethical lines he did. Mark wasn't sure if he believed her, but right now it didn't matter. She was the only person still moving forward, still digging, and she'd promised to help him search for his daughter, even if it meant going off-grid, even if it meant burning what little reputation she had left. The media caught wind of the story, but only scratched the surface. The headlines were vague, sanitized. Corruption scandal rocks intelligence community. Missing girl key witness in black site probe. Whistleblower former cop resurfaces in investigation. None of them told the full truth. None of them mentioned the real scale of what had been unearthed, the trafficking ring cloaked in military contracts and national security excuses, or the network of surveillance that monitored targets deemed expendable. It was too big, too dark, and too dangerous for full exposure. But the ripples had started. And Mark knew, in time, the tide would rise. Amanda's breathing slowed, her fingers twitching as if reaching for something in a dream. Mark gently took her hand, grounding her back to the moment. She stirred, opened her eyes slowly, and whispered the question that had haunted both of them. What happens now? Mark didn't have the perfect answer, but he leaned in and said the only thing he truly believed in that moment. We fight, and we don't stop until we find the others. He didn't mean just the other girls. He meant his daughter. He meant every missing person who was written off as a statistic. Every silence that cost someone their truth. Amanda nodded slowly, her eyes welling with something deeper than fear. Hope. The kind that comes not from safety, but from survival. That night, Mark stepped outside into the cold air. The streets glistened with rain, headlights casting long shadows across the concrete. He lit a cigarette, stared out into the city, and thought about all the things he still didn't know. Somewhere out there, people were still running the show. Somewhere a larger machine kept turning, untouched, faceless. But he was no longer a man waiting for orders or watching from the sidelines. He was back. Not as a cop. Not even as a hero. Just as a father, a fighter, and a man who'd seen behind the curtain and refused to look away. And just as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A new message. No name. Just an address. And 2 words. She's alive. The screen fades to black, the echoes of the storm still lingering.